If you're tired of corporate media bowing to fascists and fundamentalists, check out The Collective. It's a grassroots, creator-owned platform for people who believe in liberation, not empire. At The Collective, you'll find fiery essays, sharp satire, and thought-provoking articles from today's boldest, justice-minded writers. Plus, you'll get real tools to create change, like scripts to contact your congresspeople, guides to push back locally, and a nationwide directory of Black and queer-owned businesses. Use promo code RADICALLOVE for 10% off a yearly subscription. That's a savings of 20% off the monthly price. Visit thecollective.com. That's TheQuollective, and become part of something that resists, reimagines, and rebuilds.
This is Radical Love Live, an ongoing series of conversations with thought leaders exploring faith outside the boxes, hosted by Mark Dilcomb and Kelly Wilson.
So hi, everybody. Welcome back to Radical Love Live. I'm Kelly. Mark is not in the studio today. He's off on a work assignment out of state. I'm sure he's freaking awesome wherever he is. But I'm here solo today as from a host standpoint. But I'm glad to have a conversation with our friend Josh Patterson, who's the host of the Rethinking Faith podcast. And he's a student of process theology, radical theology. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation. If you haven't checked out last week's episode, we talked a lot about society and culture and the divided nature of our society right now, how we're navigating those spaces. This week, we're going to get a little more into theological space. I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that Josh is doing right now and how that's relevant to this moment in culture and society. Josh, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be back and chat again. I think it'll be a fun pickup from, like you're saying, the last time we got together.
So you were telling me when we were between episodes about a project that you're working on right now around process and radical theology. And those are terms that come up in a lot of our conversations on Radical Love Live, but we don't always pause and put in the footnote, like, by the way, process theology is this. So do you mind just giving us a little bit of an overview of some of the stuff that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently working on an edited academic volume where I am along with a team of friends. So I have a few other editors working with me, Dr. Taylor Thomas, Annie Day Rolfe, and Nick Polk. And we are bringing together leading thinkers from the process relational field and the radical theology field and trying to see where they overlap and see kind of what happens when we put these two schools of thought into conversation. And so for listeners who don't know why that's kind of maybe a weird thing to try to do, is process theology tends to be, both of these fit very nicely into like philosophical theology, that world. Process theology tends to be inherently constructive philosophically. It's comfortable doing metaphysics and making ontological truth claims about how reality works. Radical theology, on the other hand, is inherently deconstructive in the philosophical sense. So there's not a lot to do with metaphysics. There's not a lot of big ontological truth claims being made, depending on what radical theologian you're looking at. And so within process also, it's theistic. You have God. Within radical theology, you don't necessarily have a being or an entity called God. And so they seem kind of opposed to one another, but they actually both have a lot of very similar things to say. And I think the gift that they both offer the world is similar, and also I think unique and important and necessary for kind of where we find ourselves today. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring those two schools together. Or Trip Fuller just said, he was giving me a hard time, and he was like, dude, this project is just you having your own existential crisis and trying to get a whole bunch of smart people to answer the problem for you. And I told Tripp that wasn't very nice to call me out publicly.
But I noticed that you didn't deny it.
I
Huh.
didn't deny it. I did not. Tripp is a perceptive individual. That's
Yeah.
the pastoral spirit of Tripp Fuller coming out.
Yeah. Well, but that might also be the driving force behind this podcast. So I got no room to talk. For anybody who's not that familiar with process theology, that comes up a lot in our conversations. And I know it's too big to give a simple summary of, but is it possible to just touch on a couple of the principles of process theology?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I'm going to pull from Jay McDaniel, who is a brilliant process thinker. And let's see if I can remember these three things off the top of my head, because he does a really nice kind of short introductory summary. And he says, process thought has three main things or statements. One, you can't step in the same river twice. And really, you might not even be able to step in the same river once, because the world that we live in is not static. It's not made up of individual objects, but it's rather this ongoing process. It's a series of events. And so there's that. One has to do with the inherent value of all life. All life is intrinsically valuable, including not just people, but animals and the ant and the little bacteria cells and the trees. So there's that one. And then the other one is this recognition that the universe, again, is not separate, but rather deeply interconnected and interwoven in the most, literal sense possible. So everything is connected, everything is in process, nothing is static, and all life is intrinsically valuable. Are three of kind of the big themes that you get in process. And then one kind of, maybe if I were to add to Jay's thing there, one thing that I think couches all of that I think fits nicely, especially for your podcast, is the focus on love. Process thinkers tend to really have a strong conviction that God is love, and they want to be able to say that without having to cross their fingers. And so the conception of God within a process framework looks very different than kind of the God of classical theism. So love is a kind of big uniting factor in there as well.
Thank you for that. That's I love that idea of not being able to step in the same river twice. That rather than everything being somehow static, like a thing. And the more that you look at modern physics, you realize that this is all kind of illusory. Like you might. Classical physics works, if you're building a house, like you need to know like how things fit together. But if you look down on a molecular level, like everything's weird and everything, like this particle pops up over here and something disappears and goes and becomes energy. And it's kind of mind boggling when you think about it. Like even just walking on the ground, like none of this really is what it seems. It reminds me of the recent comedy routine that Pete Holmes did, where he's talking about how does the chair know it's a chair? He's like, everything. I mean, the point of his talk is everything's effing weird. Like the whole universe is weird. Like this is all made of molecules, and I'm made of molecules, but somehow my molecules know that I'm me, and these molecules know that they're them. And when I sit on them, I don't pass through them, but it's all strange. So yeah, it actually is helpful from a maintaining my sanity standpoint to think of this as more of an action or like think of it more as a verb than a collection of nouns.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, your mention of classical physics, so the person where we get process theology from was actually not a theologian, but a philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead. And he created, his thought was called a philosophy of organism. And that was then appropriated into the theological spaces, and then we get process theology. But that's exactly what he was doing, is he was like, wait a minute, quantum physics is weird, and we should have an explanation, a metaphysics that works with quantum physics, right? So he was trying to give us a worldview, a perspective that makes sense with what we were learning in science. And so, and also it can shape and mold. It's not super dogmatic, right? So it recognizing that all things are in process. And this is the one that trips people out. This is where you get, booed at in church world, is that God is in process as well. That's the creepy thing for some people, is that God is present in and through all things. And what God does is God takes all of creation into God's self in each moment, evaluates it, and then offers the next best thing to all of creation in each moment of becoming. And God is constantly doing this. And so God is learning, and we are writing history with God. We're kind of moving through time and history with the divine. So God is also in process, which that can get weird for people, I understand. But that's also one of the key elements when we talk about process theology, is that God too is
Wow.
in process.
Does that run up against the idea of the omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing God? Like, do people see that as a demotion for God?
Yeah. That's actually one of the biggest critiques, is people will say something like, "Oh, your God is impotent."
Mhm.
And there's more to it. I can try to explain it briefly, but it does push up against some of the classical attributes ascribed to God. So omnipotence is kind of rejected in process spaces. One person who does this really well, and I think they've been on your show before, but is Thomas J. Ord.
Yeah, he's been on
So
to talk about omnipotence.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So omnipotence, or love power, is Tom Ord's understanding of how omnipotence functions. And so it's not saying God is not powerful. It's just saying the kind of power God has is the power of love. And so then there are certain things God can't do because God is love, but also because God doesn't have a localized body. God is spirit within process. Like, God doesn't break the laws of physics and these kinds of things. And a lot of this stuff has to do with like hangups on theodicy problems. And so, if you wanted to address that, we could, but that's one of the issues it breaks from. It also breaks from the idea of immutability, that God doesn't change, or impassibility, that God doesn't suffer or whatever. And what process people aren't saying is that you're going to wake up one day and God might be really pissed, and then the next day God is super happy or something like that. Who God is, so the fancy way of saying it is God has an essence, experience, binate. So who God is, the essence of who God is, never changes. God is love. Say it with your whole chest. God is love.
Okay.
But God's experience changes moment to moment with creation as God is in process. So that's a little bit different. But one of the things that is still the same is that God is still, what's the word for all-knowing? Whatever the all-knowing word is. Yeah, omniscient. There we go. God is still omniscient. God knows everything there is to know. And God is continually learning in each moment of becoming. So, some people will critique process and say God isn't omniscient because God doesn't know the future. However, within a process perspective, the future does not yet exist, and therefore can't be known by God with certainty. God has a pretty good idea of what's going to happen because God has all the information in the universe available to God's self. So like, good luck beating God at checkers, right? But the future is still open. When you hear open in relational theology talked about sometimes, and this is kind of that open part. It's a claim about how the future functions.
Wow.
So yeah, those are some of the differences.
I would think that some evangelical or reformed groups would actually latch onto this because it does at least explain or make room for free will.
Yes, which is another big concern of process people. They believe that humans or creatures actually have genuine libertarian free will.
Yeah, when I could see that, like if the future is open and you're essentially co-creating with God, that not only do we have free will, but that we have a role.
Yes.
Which
Yeah,
I would think that, the people who are like kind of less deterministic, I guess, about human, the human fate would latch onto this, be like, oh, finally we have an explanation for this.
Yeah, it works very nicely there. And it also, I think part of what it does is it invites us, because God within this perspective is not controlling, non-coercive, but invites us into actualizing things that are good and beautiful and true. And so if we think poverty is a bad thing, in each moment, God is inviting us to do something about poverty,
Right.
to actualize the things that we see. So God does necessitate creaturely cooperation to carry out God's will. But again, that ties into like problems of theodicy, why we would process people would be willing to kind of make that trade-off. But it does invite us to actually kind of not just say our prayers, but then after we pray, get up off our butt and go do something about it, because we get to participate with God. We get to be like, I love co-creator is a great word. I think a biblical word,
Mhm.
co-create with the divine.
I love that.
So yeah, it's kind of cool.
So that whole, to go back to some very simple theology of, faith without works is dead, that people who
Yep.
want to talk about how it's, Christianity is a relationship, not a religion. Great. I'm totally on board with that. And now be active and dynamic in that relationship. And, that it's not just about believing the right thing, but that belief should be somehow transformative in us to want to start participating in God's work. Like, to me, that it seems to fit with that very basic understanding of Paul's theology. But I could also see some resistance along the way, because it feels a little bit willy-nilly.
Yeah, but I love the word that you used, relationship, though, because I think that's one of the key things for me why I also like this perspective, is because God exists within genuine relationship with all of creation, meaning that in the same way that God has the ability to impact us, we have the ability to impact the divine. So when bad things happen, God isn't simply allowing them and God didn't preordain them, but like those bad things actually grieve the divine, and God seeks to invite us to participate in things that will alleviate that suffering. And within classical theism, as much as people want to say we have relationship with God or they use that language, it's not internally consistent, because if God is unchanging and God doesn't suffer, that means like we don't have any impact on God. Our lives don't have any impact on God. There's a lot of talk about God being self-satisfied within the members of the Trinity. And it just gets really weird. There's no true way we can say God is relationship. And this is going to be a little bit harsh, so forgive me, but in classical theism, God just seems kind of like a rock. And in the way that I can say that I have a relationship with the rock that is in my backyard, that doesn't seem to work for me. And so that's a bit harsh of a critique, so forgive me for that. But I like the relational aspect, because we truly are not just in relationship with one another, right? I can recognize that the way I live my life is going to have impact on my neighbors, but also I'm in relationship with the divine.
The Collective isn't just another media platform. It's a justice-fueled toolbox for people who want to change the world and still laugh while doing it. You'll get access to powerful essays, brilliant satire, and original articles that speak truth to power. But it doesn't stop there. We've also got resources for writing your representatives, directories of Black and queer-owned businesses to support, and community-focused tools to help you turn conviction into action. Use promo code RADICALLOVE for 10% off a yearly subscription. That's a savings of 20% off the monthly price. Go to thecollective.com and let's build a post-fascist future together. Allow this to happen. And I know there are a number of stories of people who have left the church, abandoned their faith, because they look back and they're like, this very traumatic thing happened to me or to my child or, to this country or whatever. And they say, I can't believe that God would allow this to happen. Therefore, I abandon God. Where they could think about it another way, about this kind of like co-suffering, co-grieving God that, that is actually there to comfort us and to get into this moment with us and to urge us to help make it better for someone else.
Yeah, Alfred North Whitehead, who, like, by the way, he just something fun for people. Whitehead was an atheist. And it wasn't until he started doing this work in his philosophy of organism that he realized that, like, in order for this system to work, he needed God. And so he kind of it became a bit of a theist that way. And
Uh-huh.
he says this about God. He says, God is our fellow companion, our fellow sufferer who understands. And so, yeah, you're right. Within the kind of deterministic perspective where God preordained everything that ever happens, in my opinion, God is on the hook for evil. And
Mhm.
even in a system, the common answer to that is free will. Well, God has given people free will and whatever. So I have two issues with that. One, people who say that also typically tend to believe that God is omniscient and knows the future. And so
Mhm.
if God knows the future fully and completely, that means the future is closed. It cannot change because God does not know false things. So the future is set in stone, and then free will, again, in my opinion, becomes an illusion. But then the other issue is if God could prevent genuine evil from happening and chooses not to, that's not good either.
Like, what kind of a loving God is that?
Right. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
love,
Like if
and love does not mean what we thought it is. Like, that word does
right.
not mean what you think it did.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like if we were at a swimming pool and I was there and I don't have any kids yet, but said I was at the swimming pool with my daughter and someone tried to drown my daughter and I was just like, "Oh, I don't want to, I don't want to mess with his free will. He can just go and do that." I wouldn't win dad of the year anytime soon.
Mm.
We'll leave it at that. And so, how much more with God? If God could prevent genuine evil and chooses not to, I find that problematic, right?
Right. Well,
And I
and
mean,
free will. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, yeah, I was just going to say there is some pushback to this. Like there's a gentleman, Adam Clark. He's a black theologian, a liberation theologian, and I've talked to him before about why this kind of line of thought doesn't often get picked up in spaces like liberation theology, and it's because he says people who are on a 12-foot hole need a 15-foot ladder. They don't want to hear about the things that God can't do. So we need a God that can come along and beat up the bad guys and all this kind of thing. And my constant refrain to Adam, because how I see it, and also there was a wonderful talk at OrtCon. I forget her last name, but brilliant theologian, Jill is her first name. She kind of talked about, she countered Adam's position as another person of color and said that, in her opinion, as she sees it, open and relational theology is liberation theology because the other ones kind of endorse the status quo as is. Because God, again, is either allowing, so slavery was the example, either allowing slavery to happen or predetermined slavery to happen. But within open and relational theology, it's not God's will that it happen. Instead, God is actually actively fighting against it and inviting us to do the same thing. And so the way that I like to pose it to Adam is like, if you're praying to God to free you from slavery, and God could take you out of slavery at any moment and continuously chooses not to, I'm not a person of color. I'm not in a oppressed people group, but I would not want to worship that God.
Right. Right. It's Jill Benaglio. Benaglio.
Yes, that is
Okay.
it. Yeah, her talk was fantastic. Yeah, Jill is wonderful. I had a lot of fun conversations with her, outside of her giving
Uh
her
huh.
talk as well.
Well, definitely encourage people to check out her work.
I think process is helpful. I get why it wouldn't be, maybe for everybody, but for me, what it has afforded me the ability to do is maintain theism. It's
Mhm.
If process theology was proven false, demonstrably so, I would have a really hard time being a theist. So it's the thing that keeps me around, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. And, I find it helpful sometimes to think about. Otherwise, I'd be like Captain Dan in Forrest Gump, like up there, like, God, why did you let this happen? Come on,
Uh-huh.
talk to me. One thing I want to do is, if you don't mind, is pivot over to talk about radical theology a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to,
Let's do
we
it.
can kind of contrast the two.
Basically, some of the thoughts around radical theology started to pop up post-Holocaust.
Hmm.
Because you
Okay.
have these Jewish rabbis and theologians going like, holy crap, we are the chosen people of God. Also, the Holocaust, WTF. What is going on here? And so different people have different answers to that. This is actually probably one of the biggest questions within Jewish theology today is wrestling with the Holocaust. And what some people did was they basically said that God, the God of classical theism, is dead. This is then picked up by people like Nietzsche. So when Nietzsche says God is dead, these other philosophers of suspicion, what Nietzsche is not explicitly saying is that there is no such thing as God, but Nietzsche is saying the God of classical theism does not exist. God is dead. And then you get thinkers like Paul Tillich, who is a famous German Christian theologian, actually one of I think the only theologian to ever be on the cover of Time magazine. His book, Courage to Be, sold an insane amount of copies. But Tillich is kind of gets the nod sometimes as like a grandfather of radical theology, because his whole bit was like, God isn't a being amongst other beings, but God is the very ground of being.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have that. And then radical theology, as it continued to develop, comes along, and a person that I'm going to be pulling on from here is called John Caputo. And here's where it really gets different from Process. Caputo says, God does not exist, but God is an insistence. God is a provocation. God is a call, and somebody has to answer. And so he calls this a theology of the event. Whether or not God will have been is up to you and I. We have to give in to the call and actualize the divine potentialities. And so like the kingdom of God, to use Christian language, is not like a gift that we get after the fact, but rather God is the very work that is the kingdom of God. So it's more about, Caputo's more interested in what is getting itself done in the name of God, rather than just positing this like ontological truth claim, this being God that exists.
Okay.
And so you can see why that's wildly different, because it's technically it's atheistic, or he would write it more like a-theism, because it's kind of bridging the gap between atheism and theism. It's not really either of those, because there's still something there under the surface. And what he's doing, maybe I'll just say this one last thing that might help bring some clarity. What he's doing is he pulls very heavily on the philosopher Jacques Derrida, which, I'm sure you've talked about deconstruction on the podcast before. The philosophical idea deconstruction, which is different from how we're using it today, comes from Derrida. This is kind of one of his ideas. And what he talks about is this thing called the unconditional, or also the undeconstructible. And for him, the example that he likes to use is justice. He says justice doesn't exist, but justice is an insistence. Like, justice is this thing that we're constantly striving for, and we never really have it. We can't ever be like, all right, Kelly, we did it. Today, justice is now a thing. There are moments where we can actualize justice, right? And we have these things called laws that are supposed to help with justice, but you and I both know that just because there's a law about something doesn't mean we have justice.
Right. Oh.
Justice is this constant insistence. It's this unconditional call inviting us into something. We could say the same thing about love. And that's what Caputo does, is say, God is that. God is the unconditional call. God is that which is undeconstructible. And so where he gets nervous when, process people start doing metaphysics, is what he's saying is you are now adding conditions to the unconditional. And so you're making the unconditional, again, now conditioned, and therefore it is now deconstructible. We can deconstruct your construct that is God. Again, Caputo, to steal a line from Derrida, could rightly pass as an atheist. I think there's something a little bit different going on there. Yeah.
I'm
that was
curious.
a lot.
No, I'm curious if this is all kind of built on a foundation of the traditional understanding of God doesn't work based on the observable reality. Why drag God along into this philosophy? Why not just be like, there can't be one?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an option that people take, is to just become an atheist, which, to be honest, is a lot more appealing to me than it used to be. The way I like to joke about it is like, depending on the day, you're either going to get like Process Josh or Radical Theology Josh. But regardless of where I fall on that, the outcome is still the same, because I'm still being invited to within process, to participate with God, to actualize the good and beautiful and true, or within radical thought, I'm being invited to actualize the divine potentiality of love, right? Or something like that. So it's still calling me into something. It's still inviting something out of me and recognizing that as Christians, we have a role to play in if you want to talk about building the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven or something like that. But I think just for I don't know, this is probably going to sound very elitist and arrogant way to say it, but people who study a lot and care about having internally consistent metaphysics and these kind of things that still have this, I don't know, suspicion that God is a thing, they're going to want that image of God to cohere with reality. That's for me the whole thing. Why process works for me is because I noticed that the image of God I was handed growing up didn't align with what I was learning about how reality works and functions. And that caused a lot of tension for me. And then one thing you could do is walk away and say, I'm now an atheist. I don't believe in that God. Or you could try to find a way that God still works and functions with what we know about reality. So you get that in process, or in radical, you get people who are cheeky with the idea of God.
But it still seems oddly optimistic or altruistic, which is interesting because it seems like you can almost say radical theology was built around a kind of despair or disappointment, or there's some kind of conflict at the heart of it, but it seems like it's still pushing toward something positive.
Yeah, one way that Caputo would talk about radical theology is that it's inherently it's a parasite because it necessitates the Christian tradition or whatever. I mean, you could be a radical Muslim, Jew, whatever, but the tradition has to exist because radical theology is leeching basically off of the tradition. And it kind of serves as this, I'm not using this word in a woo-woo way, but it kind of can serve as a prophetic voice in the tradition, kind of a voice from the margin saying hey, what are we doing here? But in a sense, it still necessitates the tradition. Without Christianity, there would be no radical Christianity. You don't have it. So it almost is a critique from within. But yeah, it still does have this moral foundation, which is weird, right? Then we get into arguing about can atheists have a moral foundation if everything is subjective and blah, 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 blah. And where do you put objective truth if there's no God? So we can have that whole argument.
Right.
Which is one way you could critique radical thought. I had a conversation with Tripp recently because he's writing a chapter for this book. And he has always said that radical theology is his adjacent possible. If he wasn't a process person, he'd be radical. But some of his big concerns with radical, one of them is that they want the milk without the cow. They're trying to get all the benefits of being a Christian without actually having the thing.
Yeah.
It's a good critique. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I could imagine it. Other issues there is how do you think about the origins of things, the creator of the universe? Does it go back to a universe that kind of just happened on its own, or is time a flat circle where it just keeps coming around and coming around, or is it just a relatively powerless demiurge that created things? I could see all those questions being simmering under the surface there.
Yeah, there's tons of room to throw critique at both process and radical. Maybe radical a little bit more apparent, especially from people who tend to be more theistic. But maybe one more thing I'll say about radical to try to give them a little bit of grace, right? To throw them some slack, is that one thing that they're trying to do, and this is really helpful for someone like me, is that they're trying to weaken. So radical theology is often sometimes called weak theology. That's what Caputo would actually rather call it. Is it's weakening the word theology, a theologic, into a theopoesis, or theopoetics is another word that people might be familiar with, which is kind of a God making. And so it for me, it recognizes the strength and power of words and symbol and story And so as a Christian who grew up in that tradition, when I'm struggling and can't make these big theological claims, I can do theopoiesis. I can still, even if I'm feeling like an atheist today, I can still tell the story of the prodigal son, and it has power. It's beautiful. It changes the way I want to live in the world. Or like whatever, the teachings of Jesus. And so the poiesis aspect is something that I think is helpful. Especially for me, like faith is very much an existential thing for me. If you can't tell, I live in my brain too much.
Uh-huh.
And so how I define faith is I pull on two people, Aaron Simmons and Paul Tillich. Aaron Simmons is a Kierkegaard scholar, a phenomenologist, and he says that faith is risk in a direction. And then Tillich, how he defined faith was Tillich said,
thinking about that all
faith,
week.
yeah, faith is our matter of ultimate concern. And so for Tillich, everybody has faith. It's just whatever's that thing of ultimate concern. And then where Aaron brings in Kierkegaard is he says we should ask ourselves the question, what is worthy of our finitude? What is worthy of the fact that one day we're going to die? And so then for me, faith, I take all of that and I mix it together and I say, okay, what is my matter of ultimate concern? It is love. To me, love is the most important thing. And when I think what is worthy of my finitude, love answers that question as well. And so when I think about faith, then I'm going to risk myself in the direction of love. And the best place that I have found love is in the story of Jesus. And is in the Christian tradition that I grew up in. I can say all of that and still participate in the tradition as a radical theologian, even if I don't know if God's real.
Which honestly you don't. I mean, faith isn't really knowing per se. It's its own thing. I'm curious, and we're getting at the top of the hour, so we'll need to wrap here in a minute. And I don't want to give up your anything that isn't quite developed yet. But can you give us a preview of any of the crossover between these two perspectives?
Yeah. So I think one of the big parts of crossover is just the recognition that people or creation needs to either partner with God or work to actualize divine potential in order to make things happen in the world. And so for us today, that means that like as either process or a radical theologian, when we see things in the world that aren't good, we don't have to either say God or preordained them or God is simply allowing them, but rather God is inviting us to participate. As a process person, God is inviting us to participate. As a radical person, the call exists, the unconditional call to actualize the divine potential exists, and we have to do something about it. So I think that's one of the places of overlap. Also, a place of overlap is a rejection of the God of classical theism. Both of them are like, if that is who God is, then that God is not worthy of worship, is maybe how a process person would say it. Or, a radical person would say that God is incredulous. So like there's some overlap there. Theopoetics is a common thread. You find a lot of process people talking about theopoetics. I'm thinking of someone like Catherine Keller, maybe the absolute best at it. She's already one person that actually blends process and radical thought together with the use of theopoetics. Yeah. So those are some of the fun overlaps.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And Catherine is contributing a chapter to the book. We couldn't have it without her.
Awesome. So, yeah, she's very cool. I'm working on my theology certificate at Drew University, so I do bump into her every once in a while. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. That's what she teaches there. For people who don't know, that's the connection.
Yeah, Drew University here in New Jersey. Well, we are headed into the home stretch here. So, Josh, if people want to find more of your work, where do they find you?
Yeah, sure. So, Rethinking Faith is pretty much anywhere you like to listen to podcasts except YouTube, because I'm lazy and haven't put it on YouTube. It's really the best excuse I can give. So you can pretty much find it anywhere, but also I'm on Instagram at Rethinking Faith. It'll pop up. And then also this still feels weird to say, but I just launched a website recently. So joshuagpatterson.com is my website, and that'll come up with like things that I've written, projects I'm working on. The podcast is on there, speaking events, those kind of things. So a few spots.
All right. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with me, and we'll look forward to letting people know when your book comes out.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. Recorded at the Bravery Studios in Garfield, New Jersey. All rights reserved. Find our episodes on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And check us out at radicallovelive.com, along with our personal websites at markdilcom.com and kellywilson.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.
If your idea of self-care is dunking on fascism and reading spicy takedowns of theocracy over coffee, welcome to The Collective. It's like if James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, and The Onion had a love child and raised it on banned books and street protests. We've got savage satire, essays that slap, and articles that punch up, not down. Plus, tools to email your reps, scripts for calling your city council, and a badass directory of Black and queer-owned businesses you should have been supporting yesterday. Use code RADICALLOVE for 10% off a yearly plan and help build the post-fascist, pro-people media ecosystem we actually need. TheCollective.com. Let's raise hell and make it useful.